Hey everybody, this is Section 3 of Rosa Luxemburg's The Russian Revolution. Section 3 is titled The Nationalities Question. The Bolsheviks are in part responsible for the fact that the military defeat was transformed into the collapse and breakdown of Russia. Moreover, the Bolsheviks themselves have, to a great extent, sharpened the objective difficulties of this situation by a slogan which they placed in the foreground of their policies. The so-called right of self-determination of peoples, or something which was really implicit in this slogan, the disintegration of Russia. The formula of the right of the various nationalities of the Russian Empire to determine their fate independently, quote, even to the point of the right of governmental separation from Russia, end quote, was proclaimed again with doctrinaire obstinacy as a special battle cry of Lenin and Lenin's comrades during their opposition against Milyukovists, and then Kerensky and imperialism. Footnote. The governments of Milyukov and Kerensky were two regimes preceding that of the Bolsheviks during the earlier months of 1917, after the downfall of the Tsar. Both the Milyukov and Kerensky governments attempted to continue the war for the imperial objectives of the old Russian Empire and deny the right of the national minorities to separation from Russia. End footnote. It constituted the axis of their inner policy after the October Revolution also, and it constituted the entire platform of the Bolsheviks at Brest-Litovsk. All they had to oppose to the display of force by German imperialism. Footnote. Brest-Litovsk was the town in which the representatives of Soviet Russia conducted peace negotiations with the representatives of Germany early in 1918. End footnote. One is immediately struck with the obstinacy and rigid consistency with which Lenin and Lenin's comrades stuck to this slogan. A slogan which is in sharp contradiction to their otherwise outspoken centralism in politics, as well as to the attitude they have assumed toward other democratic principles. While the Bolsheviks showed quite a cool contempt for the Constituent Assembly, universal suffrage, freedom of press and assemblage, in short, for the whole apparatus of the basic democratic liberties of the people, which, taken all together, constituted the, quote, right of self-determination, end quote, inside Russia, they treated the right of self-determination of peoples as a jewel of democratic policy for the sake of which all practical considerations of real criticism had to be stilled. While they did not permit themselves to be imposed upon in the slightest by the plebiscite of the Constituent Assembly in Russia, a plebiscite on the basis of the most democratic suffrage in the world, carried out in the full freedom of a popular republic, and while they simply declared this plebiscite null and void on the basis of a very sober evaluation of its results, still they championed the, quote, popular vote, end quote, of the foreign nationalities of Russia on the question of which land they wanted to belong to, as the true palladium of all freedom and democracy, the unadulterated quintessence of the will of the peoples, and as the court of last resort in questions of the political fate of nations. The contradiction that is so obvious here is all the harder to understand, since the democratic forms of political life in each land, as we shall see, actually involve the most valuable and even indispensable foundations of socialist policy, whereas the famous, quote, right of self-determination of nations, end quote, is nothing but hollow, petit bourgeois phraseology and humbug. Indeed, what is this right supposed to signify? It belongs to the ABC of socialist policy that socialism opposes every form of oppression, including that of one nation by another. If, despite all this, such generally sober and critical politicians as Lenin and Trotsky and their friends have nothing but an ironical shrug for every sort of utopian phrase, such as disarmament, League of Nations, etc., have in this case made a hollow phrase of exactly the same kind in their special hobby. This arose, it seems to us, as a result of some kind of policy made to order for the occasion. Lenin and Lenin's comrades clearly calculated that there was no surer method of binding the many foreign peoples within the Russian Empire to the cause of the revolution, to the cause of the socialist proletariat, than that of offering them, in the name of the revolution and of socialism, the most extreme and most unlimited freedom to determine their own fate. This was analogous to the policy of the Bolsheviks towards the Russian peasants, whose land hunger was satisfied by the slogan of direct seizure of the noble estates, and who were supposed to be bound thereby to the banner of revolution and the proletarian government. In both cases, unfortunately, the calculation was entirely wrong. While Lenin and his comrades clearly expected that, as champions of national freedom, even to the extent of, quote, separation, end quote, they would turn Finland, the Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, the Baltic countries, the Caucasus, etc., into so many faithful allies of the Russian Revolution, we have witnessed the opposite spectacle. One after another, these, quote, nations, end quote, used the freshly granted freedom to ally themselves with German imperialism against the Russian Revolution as its mortal enemy, and under German protection, to carry the banner of counter-revolution into Russia itself. The little game with the Ukraine at Brest, which caused a decisive turn of affairs in those negotiations, and brought about the entire inner and outer political situation at present prevailing for the Bolsheviks, is a perfect case in point. The conduct of Finland, Poland, Lithuania, the Baltic lands, the peoples of the Caucasus, shows most convincingly that we are not dealing here with an exceptional case, but with a typical phenomenon. To be sure, in all these cases, it was really not the, quote, people, end quote, who engaged in these reactionary politics, but only the bourgeois and petty bourgeois classes, who in sharpest opposition to their own proletarian masses, perverted the, quote, national right of self-determination, end quote, into an instrument of their counter-revolutionary class policies. But, and here we come to the very heart of the question, it is in this that the utopian petite bourgeois character of this nationalistic slogan resides. That in the midst of the crude realities of class society, and when class antagonisms are sharpened to the utmost, it is simply converted into a means of bourgeois class rule. The Bolsheviks were to be taught to get their own great hurt, and that of the revolution, that under the rule of capitalism there is no self-determination of peoples, that in a class society, each class of the nation strives to, quote, determine itself, end quote, in a different fashion, and that for the bourgeois classes, the standpoint of national freedom is fully subordinated to that of class rule. The Finnish bourgeoisie, like the Ukrainian bourgeoisie, were unanimous in preferring the violent rule of Germany to national freedom, if the latter should be bound up with Bolshevism. The hope of transforming these actual class relationships somehow into their opposite, and of getting a majority vote for union with the Russian Revolution by depending on the revolutionary masses, if it was seriously meant by Lenin and Trotsky, represented an incomprehensible degree of optimism, and if it was only meant as a tactical flourish in the duel with the German politics of force, then it represented dangerous playing with fire. Even without German military occupation, the famous, quote, popular plebiscite, end quote, supposing that it had come to that in the border states, would have yielded a result, in all probability, which would have given the Bolsheviks little cause for rejoicing, for we must take into consideration the psychology of the peasant masses and of great sections of the petty bourgeoisie, and the thousand ways in which the bourgeoisie could have influenced the vote. Indeed, it can be taken as an unbreakable rule in these matters of plebiscites on the national question that the ruling class will either know how to prevent them where it doesn't suit their purpose, or where they somehow occur, will know how to influence their results by all sorts of means, big and little, the same means which make it impossible to introduce socialism by a popular vote. The mere fact that the question of national aspirations and tendencies towards separation were injected at all into the midst of the revolutionary struggle, and were even pushed into the foreground and made into the shibboleth of socialist and revolutionary policy as a result of the Brest Peace, has served to bring the greatest confusion into socialist ranks and has actually destroyed the position of the proletariat in the border countries. In Finland, so long as the socialist proletariat fought as a part of the closed Russian revolutionary phalanx, it possessed a position of dominant power. It had the majority of the Finnish parliament in the army. It had reduced its own bourgeoisie to complete impotence and was master of the situation within its borders. Or take the Ukraine. At the beginning of the century, before the tomfoolery of, quote, Ukrainian nationalism, end quote, with its silver rubles and its, quote, universals, end quote, and Lenin's hobby of a, quote, independent Ukraine, end quote, had been invented, the Ukraine was the stronghold of the Russian revolutionary movement. From there, from Rostov, from Odessa, from the Donetsk region, flowed out the first lava streams of the revolution, parenthesis, as early as 1902 to 1904, in parenthesis, which kindled all South Russia into a sea of flame, thereby preparing the uprising of 1905. The same thing was repeated in the present revolution, in which the South Russian proletariat supplied the picked troops of the proletarian phalanx. Poland and the Baltic states have been, since 1905, the mightiest and most dependable hearths of revolution, and in them the socialist proletariat has played an outstanding role. How does it happen, then, that in all these lands the counter-revolution suddenly triumphs? The nationalist movement, just because it tore the proletariat loose from Russia, crippled it thereby, and delivered it into the hands of the bourgeoisie of the border countries. Instead of acting in the same spirit of genuine international class policy, which they represented in other matters, instead of working for the most compact union of the revolutionary forces throughout the area of the empire, instead of defending tooth and nail the integrity of the Russian Empire as an area of revolution and opposing to all forms of separation the solidarity and inseparability of the proletarians in all lands within the sphere of the Russian Revolution as the highest command of politics, the Bolsheviks, by their hollow nationalistic phraseology concerning the, quote, right of self-determination to the point of separation, end quote, have accomplished quite the contrary, and supplied the bourgeoisie in all border states with the finest, most desirable pretext, the very banner of the counter-revolutionary efforts. There's a footnote here that I missed. The manuscript speaks of the Karbovensen, which I take to be a Germanization of the Russian word for, quote, silver ruble, end quote, probably referring to a special Ukrainian coinage and of, quote, universals, end quote, the name applied to the certain manifestos of declarations of the Ukrainian Rada, parenthesis, National Assembly, end parenthesis. Sorry, where am I? I don't know, maybe I have to reread some stuff. Instead of acting in the same spirit of genuine international class policy, which they represent in other matters, instead of working for the most compact union of the revolutionary forces throughout the area of the empire, instead of defending tooth and nail the integrity of the Russian Empire as an area of revolution and opposing to all forms of separatism the solidarity and inseparability of the proletarians in all lands within the sphere of the Russian Revolution is the highest command of politics, the Bolsheviks, by their hollow nationalistic phraseology concerning the, quote, right of self-determination to the point of separation, end quote, have accomplished quite the contrary and supplied the bourgeoisie in all border states with the finest and most desirable pretext, the very banner of the counter-revolutionary efforts. Instead of warning the proletariat in the border countries against all forms of separatism as mere bourgeois traps, they did nothing but confuse the masses in all the border countries by their slogan and deliver them up to the demagogy of the bourgeois classes. By this nationalistic demand, they brought on the disintegration of Russia itself, pressed into the enemy's hand the knife which it was to thrust into the heart of the Russian Empire, the Russian Revolution. To be sure, without the help of German imperialism, without, quote, the German rifle butts and German fists, end quote, as Kautsky's Neue Zeit put it, the Lubinskys and other little scoundrels of the Ukraine, the Eriks and Mannerheims of Finland, and the Baltic barons would never have gotten the better of the socialist masses of the workers in their respective lands. But national separatism was the Trojan horse inside which the German, quote, comrades, end quote, bayonet in hand, made their entrance into all those lands. The real class antagonism and relations of military force brought about German intervention, but the Bolsheviks provided the ideology which masked the campaign of counter-revolution. The Bolsheviks strengthened the position of the bourgeoisie and weakened that of the proletariat. The best proof is the Ukraine, which was to play so frightful a role in the fate of the Russian Revolution. Ukrainian nationalism in Russia was something quite different from, let us say, Czechish, Polish, or Finnish nationalism, in that the former was a mere whim, a folly of a few dozen petite bourgeois intellectuals without the slightest roots in the economic, political, or psychological relationships of the country. It was without any historical tradition. Since the Ukraine never formed a nation or government, was without any national culture except for the reactionary romantic poems of Shevchenko, it is exactly as if, one fine day, the people living in the Wasserkante would want to found a new Low German, Plattdeutsche, and nation and government. Footnote. Wasserkante is a region of Germany where the German dialect known as Plattdeutsch is spoken. And this ridiculous pose of a few university professors, end footnote, and this ridiculous pose of a few university professors and students was inflated into a political force by Lenin and his comrades through their doctrinaire agitation concerning the, quote, right of self-determination, including etc., quote, end quote. To what was at first a mere farce then lent such importance that the farce became a matter of the most deadly seriousness, not as a serious national movement for which, afterward as before, there are no roots at all, but as a shingle and rallying flag of counter-revolution. At Brest, out of this addled egg crept the German bayonets. There are times when such phrases have a real meaning in the history of class struggles. It is the unhappy lot of socialism that in this world war, it was given to it to supply the ideological screens for the counter-revolutionary policy. At the outbreak of the war, German social democracy hastened to deck the predatory expedition of German imperialism with an ideological shield from the lumber room of Marxism by declaring it to be a liberating expedition against Russian Tsarism, such as our old teachers, Marx and Engels, had longed for. And to the lot of the Bolsheviks, who were the very antipodes of our government socialists, did it fall to supply grist for the mill of counter-revolution with their phrase about self-determination of peoples, and thereby to supply not alone the ideology of the strangling of the Russian Revolution itself, but even for the plans of settling the entire crisis arising out of the World War. We have good reason to examine very carefully the policies of the Bolsheviks in this regard. The, quote, right of self-determination of peoples, end quote, coupled with the League of Nations and disarmament by the grace of President Wilson, constitute the battle cry under which the coming reckoning of international socialism with the bourgeoisie is to be settled. It is obvious that the phrases concerning self-determination and the entire nationalist movement, which at present constitutes the greatest danger for international socialism, have experienced an extraordinary strengthening from the Russian Revolution and the Brest negotiations. We shall yet have to go into this platform thoroughly. The tragic fate of these phrases in the Russian Revolution, on the thorns of which the Bolsheviks are themselves destined to be caught and bloodily scratched, must serve the international proletariat as a warning and lesson. And from all this, there followed the dictatorship of Germany from the time of the Brest Treaty to the time of the, quote, supplementary treaty, end quote. The 200 explanatory sacrifices in Moscow. From this situation arose the terror and the suppression of democracy. Footnote. 6 weeks after signing the signing of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, there was a codicil or supplement signed. The, quote, 200 expiatory sacrifices, end quote, may refer to the execution of persons charged with complicity in the assassination of the German ambassador to Russia, Count von Mirbach. He was shot by terrorists of the Socialist Revolutionary Party which had cooperated with the Bolsheviks until the signing of the Brest Treaty, and then went into opposition and tried to prevent the signing of the treaty. From then on, the Russian government was a one-party government. End footnote. That's the end of section 3 of Rosa Luxemburg's The Russian Revolution. Thank you so much for listening. The next section, section 4, is titled The Constituent Assembly.